Inside the marble grand hall surrounded by Boston's wealthiest families, the bride, Olivia Bennet, pointed at a plainly dressed stranger and ordered security to drag him out.
He came here in a
His suit
taxi?
was faded. He had arrived by taxi. In front of 300 guests, she called him a man who clearly did not belong among people like them. The stranger did not argue. He picked up his brown paper gift and walked toward the doors. Then the room froze. The groom, Tyler Vaughn, came running after him.
Harold, don't go!
His face white with panic. Who was this quiet man? The Vaughn estate sat on a cliff above the water, a white stone mansion that looked like it had been built to be photographed. On the morning of the wedding, the lawns were trimmed to the inch-white roses, climbed the iron gates, and a string quartet tuned their instruments under a tent that cost more than most people in Boston earned in a year. Everything about the place announced money, old and quiet, and certain of itself. Olivia Bennet had spent 2 years dreaming, and now that it had arrived, she intended for nothing to go wrong. She stood in the bridal suite on the second floor, looking at herself in a tall mirror, while 2 assistants adjusted the hem of her gown. The dress had been flown in from a designer she could not have afforded a few years earlier, back when she was just another exhausted associate, billing hours she would never see the benefit of. Now she was marrying into the Vaughn name. The 300 guests downstairs were all proof that she had finally crossed a line she had spent her whole life trying to reach. She studied her reflection and felt something close to down in the main hall. The guests were beginning to gather. They were the kind of people Olivia had studied from a distance for years. The families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. The men who spoke softly because they had never once needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. She had learned their manners, their references, the precise way they held a... She had remade herself in their image so completely that she sometimes forgot the small apartment and the second-hand furniture she had come from. Today, surrounded by them, she planned to forget it entirely. Tyler Vaughn moved through the crowd downstairs with the ease of a man born into it. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, and laughed at the right moments, but his attention kept drifting toward the entrance. There was one guest he was waiting for, a man he had invited personally, without telling Olivia much about him, beyond the fact that he mattered. Tyler did not explain because he assumed it would not come up, and because the full truth of who the man was, he simply wanted him there on the most important day of his life. The man arrived a little after noon. A yellow taxi pulled up the long gravel drive, looking absurd among the black town cars and the valet attendants in white gloves. The door opened, and Harold Whitman stepped out, a man somewhere in his middle years, broad through the shoulders with the unhurried movements of someone who had spent a life doing real work. His suit was clean,
Who invited him
visibly
here?
old. The gray of it faded at the elbows, and his shoes had been
came here in a
polished so
taxi?
many times the leather had thinned. In his hands, he carried a small gift, wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a valet approached him, then hesitated, unsure whether this was a guest or someone who had wandered to the wrong address. Harold smiled and said only that he had been invited, and he walked past the young man toward the entrance without waiting to be escorted. He did not seem to notice the looks he drew, or if he noticed them, he had long ago stopped caring. He moved through the marble doorway and into the grand hall, though no one in the room understood it. Yet the reaction was immediate and quiet, the way contempt is always quiet, among people who consider themselves refined. Conversations did not stop so much as cool. A woman in pale silk glanced at his shoes and turned back to her companion with a small smile. 2 men near the bar followed him with their eyes and exchanged a look that needed no words. No one said anything cruel, because cruelty out loud would have been beneath them. They simply made that the man did not belong, and they were certain he could feel it. Harold found a place near the wall away from the center of the room and stood there holding his gift. He did not approach the bar or try to introduce himself to anyone.
Who let you in here?
He watched
I was
the room,
invited.
the way
I only
a
came to
man
offer my
watches weather,
congratulations.
with a
Perhaps
kind
the
of
staff-
patient detachment, and waited for the only person he had come to see. He had no interest in the opinions of the people around him. He had spent a great deal of his life among people exactly like them, and he had learned long ago how little their approval was worth. Olivia came down the staircase a few minutes before the ceremony was meant to begin, and the room turned to her the way she had always imagined it would. For a moment, she let herself drink it in the soft sound of admiration, the lifted glasses, the certainty that she was finally the center of a world she had fought to enter. Then her eyes moved across the hall and caught on the figure by the wall, and the feeling curdled in her chest before she could name it. Holding a package wrapped in brown paper, standing among silk and diamonds like a stain on a clean tablecloth, her first thought was that someone had made a mistake. The catering staff, perhaps, or a delivery man who had wandered in through the wrong door. She crossed the floor toward him with a fixed smile, intending to handle it quietly before anyone made more of it than they already had. Mrs. Eleanor Von Tyler's mother intercepted her, halfway, her voice pitched low and pleasant, in the way that carried farther than a shout. She wondered aloud
You
with
don't
delicate
belong
concern
here! Get him out
whether
of
the
my
help had
wedding!
perhaps
Sir,
lost their way,
we're going to have
and
to
whether
ask you to
someone
leave.
ought to see to it. The remark was small, almost gentle, but it landed in Olivia like a match against dry paper. Eleanor Vaughn had spent the engagement studying her future daughter-in-law with a polite skepticism Olivia had felt in every shared meal, every careful question about her family, her background, where exactly she had come from. Olivia had worked so hard to be seamless to give the woman nothing to point at, and now there was a man in a $30 suit, standing, and the implication hung in the air that he was somehow hers to explain. She reached the man by the wall and spoke to him in a low, controlled voice, asking who he was and who had let him in. Harold met her eyes calmly and answered that he had been invited and that he was simply waiting to offer his congratulations. Something in the steadiness of his manner only made it worse, the way he refused to shrink or apologize, the way he stood there as if he had as much right to the room as anyone in it. To Olivia in that moment, his composure looked like arrogance, and his presence looked like a threat to everything she had built. Around them, the guests had begun to notice the exchange, and Olivia could feel 300
No,
pairs
please,
of eyes
wait!
turning slowly toward the corner of the room.
Harold, don't go!
She felt the old terror rising, the terror of being seen for what she had once been, of being exposed in front of the only people whose opinion she had decided mattered. She thought of Eleanor Vaughn's pleasant, knowing smile, and of the years she had spent climbing toward this single afternoon. And a cold, she decided in the space of a breath that the man had to be removed. When Harold shifted his weight, the edge of his sleeve caught a tray a passing server had set down on a side table, and a glass of champagne tipped and shattered against the marble floor. The sound cut across the hall like a gunshot. In truth, it was nothing an accident anyone might have caused, and Harold immediately bent to gather the larger pieces with his bare hands, murmuring an apology to the servant. With the whole room watching, and her future mother-in-law's smile burning a hole in her, it was the final unbearable. She straightened, and her voice when it came was loud enough to reach every corner of the room, sharp and clear and merciless. She told the man that he had no place here, that he had clearly stumbled into a world he did not understand, and that his presence was an insult to everyone who had been properly invited. She called him an embarrassment, a man who could not even stand in a room like this without breaking something. And she said it in front of 300 people, very quiet. Harold rose slowly from where he had crouched over the broken glass, a small cut on his thumb, and looked at her. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice, or try to defend himself, or explain who he was, though a single sentence would have changed everything in that room. He simply looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was not anger, but something closer to disappointment, the look of a man recognizing something sad and familiar. Olivia turned to the two security men standing near the entrance and ordered them in front of all those witnesses to escort the man out. The guards hesitated, glancing at one another, because there was nothing threatening about Harold, nothing that warranted being thrown from a wedding. But Olivia's voice cracked like a whip a second time, and they moved toward him more apologetic than forceful, gesturing toward the doors. The hall watched in a silence so complete that the string quartet had stopped playing without anyone telling. Harold raised one hand slightly, a small gesture that told the guards they did not need to touch him. He bent and picked up the brown paper gift he had set on the side table, brushing a fleck of glass from its surface with surprising care. Then he straightened his old jacket, gave Olivia a final glance that held no malice, only a quiet, weary understanding, and turned toward the exit. He walked through the parting crowd without hurrying his shoulders, and the guests drew back from him as though poverty were something that might rub off. For one moment, Olivia felt the hot rush of victory. The intruder was leaving the room was hers again, and she had handled the threat decisively in front of the very people she most wanted to impress. She caught Eleanor Vaughn's eye and saw something she could not quite read, and she told herself it was approval. She lifted her chin and prepared to turn the afternoon back toward the ceremony, toward the future she had fought so hard to claim, the danger she believed had passed. It was then that Tyler entered the hall from a side door, having heard the commotion from the gardens, where he had been waiting for the ceremony to begin. He came in mid-step and took in the scene at once: the broken glass, the silent guests, the figure walking toward the exit with a brown paper package in his hands. His face changed in a way that everyone in the room could see the easy confidence draining out of it, replaced by something raw and frightened. He went pale, genuinely pale. The color leaving his face as though he had seen something catastrophic. He said the man's name just once loud enough to carry, and there was a note in his voice that made the guests turn to stare at him. It wasn't the voice of a host dealing with an awkward guest. It was the voice of a man watching a disaster unfold, watching something precious slip out of a door before he could stop it. Without another word to his bride, without a glance at his mother, or the 300 people waiting for him to marry her, he went after Harold, calling out, weaving between the stunned guests, his expensive shoes skidding on the marble. The room watched their groom chase the shabby stranger toward the doors, with naked panic on his face, and a low murmur began to rise, confusion turning into the first sharp edge of suspicion. This was not how a man behaved over a wedding crasher. This was how a man behaved when something far more important than a ceremony. Olivia stood frozen at the center of it all, her triumph collapsing in real time. She watched her fiancé run after the man she had just humiliated, and for the first time, a cold thread of doubt worked its way into her chest. She did not understand what she was seeing. Tyler had never mentioned the man, had never described him, and yet he was racing across his own wedding hall as though everything depended on catching him. Whatever was happening, the guests were no longer hiding their reactions. Heads bent toward one another, voices low and urgent eyes moving back and forth between the bride at the center of the room and the groom disappearing through the entrance. Eleanor Vaughn's pleasant mask had slipped entirely, and she stared after her son with an expression of dawning alarm, as though she alone in the room had begun to guess at the size of. Olivia caught the look on the older woman's face and felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself Tyler was simply being polite, that he had recognized a business acquaintance and wanted to smooth over the rudeness, that the whole thing would be explained in a moment and forgotten by evening. But the explanation rang false even inside her own head, because no one chased a polite acquaintance with that kind of fear in their eyes. She stood in her flawless dress in the room she had conquered and felt the first real understanding that she might have done something she could not take back. Outside, the taxi was still idling at the bottom of the gravel drive, the driver having decided to wait. Harold walked toward it without looking back, the brown paper gift still in his hands, and behind him, Tyler's voice rose again, closer now, pleading with him to stop, to wait, to come back inside. The wedding had not even begun, and already it had broken into pieces no one had seen coming. The quiet man in the faded suit had not said a single word in his own defense, and somehow that silence had become the loudest thing in the entire estate. In the grand hall, 300 of Boston's most powerful guests turned almost as one to look at the bride, who had thrown a man out for being poor. And Olivia Bennet, who had spent her whole life learning how to be seen by exactly these people, suddenly understood that they were seeing her now in a way she had never wanted. Something enormous was hidden inside that brown paper package and that faded suit. Something her fiancé knew, and the not knowing had begun to feel like the ground opening beneath her. For a few minutes after Tyler disappeared through the entrance, Olivia held her composure together by sheer force of will. She turned to the nearest cluster of guests with a practiced smile and made a light remark about the groom's nerves, about how even the most confident men lost their heads on a wedding day. A few people smiled back politely, but the smiles did not reach their eyes, and the murmuring did not stop. She moved through the room as if nothing, refilling the silence with small talk, and all the while a cold voice in the back of her mind kept asking why her fiancé had run after a man in a faded suit, as though his life depended on it. She convinced herself for a little while that Tyler was simply being gracious. He had always been kinder than the people he came from, quicker to notice when someone was being slighted. Perhaps the man had been a contractor who had once done work on a Vaughn property, or an old employee Tyler felt some loyalty toward, and the entire scene had been nothing more than Tyler's good manners colliding with her own bad timing. She told herself that the way a person repeats a comforting lie and almost managed to believe it, but the guests would not let her believe it. Near the windows, Eleanor Vaughn stood with two other women from the oldest families in the room, and the three of them were speaking in the low, urgent tones of people who had recognized something the bride had not. Eleanor's face had lost all its earlier smoothness. Olivia caught fragments of their attention, turning toward her. The slight shifts of posture that told her she was being discussed, found wanting in a way that had nothing to do with her dress or her manners, and everything to do with the man she had just thrown out. Tyler returned almost 20 minutes later, alone. He came in through the same side door, and Olivia saw at once that he had not caught the man that whatever he had run after had gotten away from him. His tie was loosened, his face still pale, and he walked straight toward her, without acknowledging a single guest. He took her gently by the arm and steered her out of the hall into a quiet drawing room off the main corridor and closed the door. The change in him frightened her more than the running had. She started to explain herself the moment they were alone, the words tumbling out in a defensive rush. She told him she had only been protecting the day that the man had wandered in, looking like he belonged on a loading dock, that he had broken a glass and made a scene, and embarrassed her in front of his mother and half of Boston. She said she had done what anyone would have done, and that she did not understand why Tyler was looking at her the way he was, as though she had committed some unforgivable crime instead of removing an obvious intrusion. Tyler listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked her one question in a flat, careful voice. He asked whether she had any idea who that man was. She told him, of course, she did not, that the man was a stranger, that strangers in cheap suits did not get to crash weddings like this one. And Tyler closed his eyes briefly the way a man does when bracing himself, and told her that the stranger she had just humiliated was Harold. The name meant nothing to her, and she said so. Tyler explained slowly, as if the explaining itself was difficult, that Harold Whitman was the man who had quietly founded Pierce & Halloway, the private investment fund, whose name she had heard 100 times without ever knowing the face behind it. She still did not fully grasp it, and so Tyler said the part that mattered most, the part that drained the last of the Pierce & Halloway was the fund that had saved his family's company from collapse years earlier, when everything the Vaughns owned had been weeks away from being lost. Olivia stood very still as the meaning of it settled over her. The Vaughn fortune, the estate she was standing in, the name she was about to marry into the entire world she had clawed her way toward, none of it would have existed without the man in the faded suit. Tyler told her that years earlier, when his father had been drowning in debt, and no respectable, a quiet man named Harold Whitman had appeared and put together the rescue that pulled them back from ruin. He had asked for almost nothing in return, and he had never once flaunted what he had done. Tyler went on, his voice low and unsteady. telling her how rarely anyone in his world ever saw the man at all. Harold did not attend galas or charity dinners or sit for photographs. He ran his fund from a small office, used a different professional name in his earliest dealings to keep his private life entirely separate, and lived in a way that gave no hint of the fortune he controlled. The handful of powerful people who knew the truth treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence, precisely because he refused to ask for it. Tyler had met him only twice, both times, across a table where enormous sums of money changed hands, and he had never forgotten the man's quiet, unhurried certainty. It was Tyler who had invited him. He had wanted, on the most important day of his life, to have present the one man who had made the Vaughn name worth marrying into, at all the man without whom there would have been no estate, no fortune, no wedding. He had not told Olivia much about the guest, because he had not imagined it would matter, because it had never once occurred to him that his bride would look at a plainly dressed man and see only an embarrassment to be swept out the door. Olivia felt the floor of her certainty give way beneath her. The man she had called an embarrassment, the man she had ordered security to drag from the room in front of 300 witnesses, was the silent foundation of everything she had spent her life trying to reach. She had not insulted a stranger. She had insulted the architect of the very world she worshipped, and she had done it loudly, cruelly, with the whole of Boston society watching. The cut on his thumb from the broken glass rose up in her memory, and the patient, disappointed look he had given her, and she understood at last what that look had meant. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and tried to find some way to reach him, asking Tyler for a number, an address, anything. Tyler gave her what little he had, a private line that Harold sometimes answered, and she called it 3 times in a row. It rang and rang into nothing. She left a message the second time, her voice thin and unfamiliar to her own ears, an apology that sounded hollow, even as she spoke it. There was no answer, only the silence of a man who had already decided there was nothing left to say. While she stood in the drawing room with the dead phone in her hand, the story was moving through the hall outside like a tide. The guests had begun to understand in pieces and whispers exactly who the man in the faded suit had been, and what the bride had done to him. The knowledge passed from one cluster to the next, and with it came a slow collective recalculation of who Olivia Bennet actually was. The admiration she had basked in an hour earlier curdled into something called a fascinated contempt, the particular cruelty reserved for someone who has revealed themselves to be smaller. When Olivia finally returned to the hall, she felt a change at once. People who had complimented her dress now looked through her, or worse, watched her with open curiosity, the way one watches an animal that has done something stupid and is about to be punished for it. Conversations dropped as she passed and resumed behind her back. Eleanor Vaughn would not meet her eyes at all. The room that had turned to admire her on the staircase now turned away, and she walked through it, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt in her life, more exposed than in the small apartment she had spent years trying to outrun. Tyler found her again near the edge of the room, and what was in his face now was not anger, but something far harder to bear. It was disappointment, deep and personal, the disappointment of a man discovering that the person he had chosen was not the person he had believed her to be. He told her quietly that he kept replaying the moment he had walked in, the moment he had seen her standing over Harold with that look on her face, ordering him out for. He told her he had not been able to recognize her in that moment, and that the not recognizing her had frightened him more than anything else. She tried to defend herself again, to explain the pressure she had felt, the way his mother had looked at her, the years of being made to feel that she did not belong. But the words came out small and self-justifying, and she heard how they sounded, even as she spoke them. Tyler shook his head slowly. He told her the point was not that she had made a mistake, but that she had looked at a human being and decided his worth from the cost of his clothes, and that she had done it with a confidence that suggested it was not the first time. He said he had spent his whole life surrounded by people who did exactly that, and that he had loved her because he believed she was different. The accusation landed harder than any insult, because it was true, and Olivia knew it was true. She thought of the way she had remade herself, the way she had learned to measure rooms and people by their surfaces, the way she had come to feel a flicker of shame whenever anyone reminded her of where she had come from. She had become fluent in exactly the kind of judgment Tyler was describing. She had become the kind of person who would look at a man in a faded suit, and the realization sat in her chest like a stone. The afternoon wore on with no ceremony. The string quartet had long since stopped. The guests were beginning to drift toward the doors in small, uncomfortable groups, and the great tent on the lawn stood empty and absurd in the sunlight. No one spoke of the wedding anymore. The thing they had come to celebrate had quietly ceased to exist somewhere in the last hour, and everyone in the room seemed to understand it, except perhaps Olivia, who kept glancing toward the entrance as though Harold might somehow walk back through it and give her the chance to undo what she had done. He did come back, but not for the reason she hoped. In the late afternoon, when much of the crowd had thinned, Harold returned to the estate in a plain car he had called for himself, calm and unhurried, the brown paper gift still in his hands. He had not come to accept an apology or to claim the recognition he was owed. He came to return the wedding invitation he had been sent and to hand back the gift he had brought because he no longer saw any reason to leave it. He found Tyler and Olivia together near the foot of the great staircase, and the few remaining guests fell silent to watch. He set the brown paper package down on a side table without ceremony and laid the engraved invitation beside it. He spoke to Olivia directly, his voice even, and without bitterness, and told her that he did not hold the afternoon against her, that he had been thrown out of finer rooms than this one by people who thought a great deal less of themselves than they should have. But he said that what saddened him was not the insult to it, was watching a young woman with every advantage in front of her decide that a person's value could be read off the price of his suit, and do it without a flicker. He told her that he had built a great deal in his life, and that the one thing he had learned, the only thing he truly believed mattered, was that the people who quietly held the world up were almost never the ones standing in the center of the room, demanding to be admired. He said he had hoped walking in that morning to see a wedding between two people who understood that. Instead, he had seen something that reminded him of every reason he had spent his life staying out of rooms exactly like this one. Then he wished them both well, with a sincerity that was somehow worse than anger. Tyler stepped forward before Harold reached the door, and what he said next stopped the room cold. He told Harold and the remaining guests and Olivia that there would be no wedding that day. He said it quietly, but there was no uncertainty in it. He told Olivia that he could not stand at an altar and promise his life to someone who had shown him in the clearest possible way that she would measure the people he loved by what he said. He needed to understand who she really was before he could decide whether he had ever known her at all. Olivia heard the words and felt the whole structure of her life come apart in a single instant. She was losing the marriage, the name, the world she had fought for, and she was losing it in front of the very people she had wanted to impress. And worst of all, she was losing it because of something she had done with her own mouth in full view, certain she was in the right. She reached for Tyler, and he stepped back from her, gently but completely. And the gesture was, she stood at the foot of the staircase in her flawless gown as Harold walked out a second time, and Tyler turned away from her, and the last of the guests gathered their things and left without saying goodbye. The triumph of the morning had become the lowest moment of her life, and she had no one to blame for any of it but herself. For the first time in years, stripped of the name and the approval she had built her identity around Olivia, Bennett had no idea who she was, and in that, finally something in her began to break open. Olivia did not sleep that night. She left the estate in the same gown she had spent 2 years dreaming about, climbed into a car alone, and rode back to the city, while the cliffs and the white tent shrank behind her. The dress felt absurd, now a costume from a play that had been canceled in the middle of the first act. By the time she reached her apartment, she had stopped crying, and what remained was something quieter and more dangerous, the slow, unbearable work of seeing herself clearly for the first time in years. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, replaying the afternoon. She kept returning to the look Harold had given her, the cut on his thumb, the calm with which he had picked up his gift, and walked out twice without raising his voice. She had spent the whole day believing she was the one with power in that room, the one defending the order of things, and she understood now that the only person in the entire hall who had behaved with genuine dignity was the man she had thrown out of it. The realization did not arrive gently. It came like a wound, finally being felt after the shock wears off. In the days that followed, she could not stop thinking about him. She wanted to understand the man she had insulted, and so she did what her training had made her good at, which was to find things out. She learned piece by piece the shape of a life that had been deliberately kept small. Harold Whitman had grown up with nothing, had worked his way through years of jobs no one wanted, and had eventually built something enormous in the quietest way a person could. He had chosen to keep living as if he had not in the same modest neighborhood, in the same plain clothes, refusing every invitation to be celebrated. What struck her most was not the size of what he had built, but the way he carried it. She found stories small and scattered of people he had helped without ever attaching his name to the help debts. He had quietly forgiven families. He had pulled back from ruin, the same way he had pulled back the Vaughns. He had spent decades giving things to people who never knew it was him, and asking for nothing in return, least of all the kind of admiration Olivia had spent her. He had everything she wanted, and he had decided on purpose to want none of what she wanted. It forced her to look at her own life from the outside, and what she saw made her ill. She thought about the apartment she had grown up in, the second-hand furniture, the years her family had counted dollars at the end of every month. She had spent her adulthood running from all of it, scrubbing it out of her voice, and her manners, learning to feel embarrassed by the very people who had once been her own. Somewhere in the climb, she had decided that, and she had let that decision quietly hollow her out, until she became a woman who could throw a kind man out of a room for the crime of looking poor. She understood finally that she had become exactly what she had once feared and resented. As a younger woman, she had hated the people who looked through her, who measured her by her shoes and her address, and found her wanting. She had promised herself she would never be cruel the way they were cruel. And then she had spent years studying them so closely that she had, and on the most important day of her life, she had performed their cruelty more perfectly than any of them. The person she had turned into was the person she had set out to escape. Meanwhile, Harold had quietly begun arranging to leave Boston. The afternoon at the estate had confirmed something he had long suspected about the world he stayed at the edges of, and he saw no reason to remain in a city that kept reminding him of it. He told the few people who needed to know that he would be moving on, handing more of the fund's daily work to others, stepping further back into the private life he had always preferred. He did not think of Olivia with anger. He thought of her, when he thought of her at all, as a sad example of something he had watched. Ruin better people than her. The belief that being admired was the same as being worth something. Olivia learned he was leaving from Tyler, who still spoke to her, carefully, and from a distance, in the strange, suspended time after a wedding that had not happened. Tyler had not gone back to her, but he had not entirely closed the door either. He was watching, she understood, to see what she would do, whether the woman in the hall had been who she truly was, or only what fear had made of her for an afternoon. She knew, and more importantly, would answer it for herself. She found out where Harold could be reached, and she went to him before he could leave the city. She did not bring flowers or a gift, or any of the careful gestures she would once have used to manage a situation. She came with nothing but herself, in plain clothes, with no audience, and no advantage to gain, because for once, she was not trying to win anything. She found him in the small office he worked from, packing a few belongings into boxes, and he looked up as though he had half expected she might come. She told him she had not come to be forgiven. She told him she knew that what she had done could not be undone by an apology, and that she did not deserve to have it undone. She said the things she had been afraid to say, even to herself, that she had looked at him and seen only his clothes, that she had thrown him out to protect an image of herself. She should have been ashamed of that the cruelty had not come from nowhere, but from years of letting herself become smaller and harder while pretending she was becoming more. She said all of it plainly without trying to soften it. Harold listened the way he had listened in the hall, without interrupting, without offering her the easy relief of telling her it was all right. When she finished, he asked her a single question, which was whether she understood what had actually been wrong with what she did. He told her he did not particularly care that she had insulted a wealthy. What had troubled him was that she would have done exactly the same thing to a man who truly was poor, a man with no hidden fortune to redeem him, and she would have felt just as righteous doing it. The lesson, he said, was not that he had turned out to be rich. The lesson was that it should never have mattered. She told him he was right, and that she understood it now, and that the understanding had cost her nearly everything she had built. She did not say it to win his sympathy. She said it because it was true, and because she had stopped somewhere in the last days performing for the people in front of her. Harold studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression eased, not into warmth exactly, but into a kind of cautious recognition. The look of a man who had seen a great many people refuse to change and was quietly surprised to watch one. What Olivia did next was the thing that mattered, the thing that proved the apology was more than words. She did not let her remorse stay private and safe. She went back to the people who had watched her throw Harold out, the families and the names she had spent years trying to impress, and she told them plainly that she had been wrong. She wrote to them, and she spoke to the one, and she said without excuse that she had judged a good man by his clothes and humiliated him for it, and that the shame of it was hers alone. She did it knowing it would cost her every shred of the standing she had clawed her way toward, and the world she had wanted so badly turned its back on her, for it, of course. The families who admired confidence and success had no use for public contrition, and the invitations stopped, and the doors she had pried open swung shut again. She had made herself in their eyes an embarrassment, the very word she had thrown at Harold. But she found to her own astonishment that losing all of it did not feel like the catastrophe she had once imagined. It felt like setting down something heavy she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was not part of her. Tyler heard about what she had done, the public correction, the deliberate burning of everything she had built, and he came to find her. He told her that he had been waiting to see whether she would protect herself or tell the truth, and that she had told the truth in the one way that could only have hurt her. He said that the woman who had done that was someone he could recognize again, someone he wanted to know. He did not pretend and he did not promise that everything would simply return to what it had been. He said only that he wanted to begin again honestly with both of them, as they actually were. Harold did not leave Boston after all. Whether it was Olivia's apology or something else that changed his mind, he stayed, and when Tyler and Olivia decided to marry quietly this time, they asked him to be there. The second wedding looked nothing like the first. There was no cliffside estate, no string quartet, no 300 guests measuring one another across a marble hall. There was a small room, a handful of people who genuinely cared about the two of them, and a plainness that the old Olivia would have been mortified by, and the new one found she preferred. Harold came in the same kind of clothes he always wore, and this time no one in the room looked at his suit, because the people in the room were not the kind who would. When the moment came, it was Harold who walked the length of the small room beside Olivia, the man she had thrown out now standing beside her, with the quiet dignity she had finally learned to see, and every person present understood the weight of it. And it turned out to hold nothing extravagant, only something simple and chosen with care, which somehow made it the most valuable thing in the room. Afterward, the three of them stood together, and the distance that had opened between them began slowly to close. Olivia did not try to repay Harold, or to make herself useful to him, or to earn anything from the connection, because she had finally learned that the impulse to extract value from people was the very thing that had ruined her. She simply let herself know him, an ordinary-seeming man who had done extraordinary things, and in knowing him, she kept learning the lesson she had nearly destroyed her life to miss. In the years that followed, Olivia stopped chasing the perfect image she had once organized her entire existence around. She did not become poor, and she did not pretend to be something she was not, but she let go of the need to be admired by people whose admiration had never been worth having. She learned to look at a stranger and see a person rather than a price, and she came to understand that the version of herself she had been on that wedding day had not been her true self at all. Only the worst thing fear and ambition could have made of her. Harold went on, living the way he always had, plainly and quietly in the same neighborhood and the same kind of faded suits, controlling a fortune that almost no one knew about and wanting nothing it could buy him. The people who knew the truth about him treated him with a respect he never asked for, and the people who did not know simply saw an ordinary man going about it. He had learned long ago that the moment a person needs to be seen as important is the moment they have already lost the thing that actually makes them so. Tyler, for his part, carried away from the whole affair a lesson he never forgot, which was that the dignity of a person could not be measured by their clothes or their address or the car that brought them to the door. He had nearly married a woman who did not understand that, and he had nearly lost her when she learned it too late, and the two near misses taught him to watch for the rest of his life, the ones who held things up without asking to be thanked. What remained when all of it had settled was a single hard truth that Olivia would carry for the rest of her life. The most dangerous thing a person can do is not to be poor, and not to start with nothing, but to lose their gratitude toward the people who quietly carry the world, and to begin measuring human worth by the surface of things. She had learned it the hardest way there was, by nearly throwing away her own life to a stranger, and she never again forgot that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who built in silence the entire world standing behind you.